Dana Nessel, the Attorney General out of Michigan, has now released this summary of campaign finance complaints filed against Benson. And there's a conclusion in here that says Jocelyn broke the law. Now, as they write to Crane and Brewer, they say the Secretary of State Jocelyn, as required by the law, referred to this office campaign finance complaints filed against Jocelyn. So the Secretary of State has to, when you get a complaint against the Secretary of State, give it over to the AG. Can't investigate yourself. Hey, Jocelyn Benson, you're the Secretary of State. You're supposed to be making sure people aren't rigging our elections and violating campaign finance law and managing the elections in the state. What happens if you're the one who's rigging and violating the law? What do? Oh, then it has to go over to the AG's office. Now, question, did she violate Michigan Campaign Finance Act? This letter concerns the disposition of complaints filed by 3 people. What's up? Christian, Tyler, and Monica. All 3 complaints filed against Jocelyn said that Jocelyn used the lobby of the Richard Austin building on January 22nd to hold a press conference to announce she's running for governor. You can't use a public building on this for this. During the January 22nd press conference, Benson made a statement and then answered several questions. At one point, Benson was asked why the press conference was being held inside the building. Why are you here? You're not like in this office, are you? Onto the building steps, Benson answered that she didn't want people to stand outside in the cold weather. Oh, now according to the historical weather data, the temperature in Lansing was at or below 0 with double-digit wind speeds. They say, okay, so it was pretty dang cold out there. Saying, all right. One reporter commented, that's unusual. Someone said, other candidates are not allowed to be inside the building. You're not in this powerful building as someone in power. So you don't get to make your announcement here. Other candidates have not been allowed to do so. When the reporter asked if other candidates could also use the lobby, and she's the secretary, like she runs the rules. So no, you wouldn't let anyone else come in here and use this. Why are you using this? For a similar press conference in this election, she said, of course they can. Yeah, no, they can, no problem. She went on to state that it had never come to her attention that others had been prevented from using this. She said, oh wait, you can't use this building? Oh no, I'm the Secretary of State, I had no idea. So they say, actually, yeah, a public body or person acting for a public body, the law says, shall not use anything for their campaign that's not approved. So the complaint comes in and says, to the extent those complaints raise claims against Jocelyn and the governor, those claims are dismissed. Says, although the committee would fall within the definition of a person, it's not a public body. And so we're going to say, what is the claim against Benson? So there was a claim against her, like her committee. Okay, this is not about committees who break the law. It's about people who break the law. So we're going to evaluate this based on Benson. Now, the Department of State has recognized for the purposes of this law that a space is a violation of the law. Public resources, including space like a building, that's a violation. So we've already found that out. Like that complaint we resolved back in 2024. Here, Benson did use the lobby of the Austin building to announce her campaign, and that is prohibited. Now, the campaign committee, however, has made 4 arguments in support of this position that it was not prohibited and it's not a violation. So Jocelyn said, actually, I am allowed to do this. Says 2 of the arguments are similar, will be addressed together. Says the committee first argues that she was not a person acting for a public body. So the law doesn't really apply to her. They said, well, that's not how this works. We use a reasonable person standard in analyzing these claims. And we've also found unpersuasive an argument that a public body did not authorize certain social media posts. They said, well, reasonable person would not have had any indication the posts were made by a third party. So a similar thing is warranted here. If someone is making posts that look official, you have to presume they're official unless there's some disclaimer in there that someone else made it and it's not official. Here, looks pretty official. She invited members of the press inside the Austin building, then conducted a press conference, professionally dressed during the day in a lobby of a building that houses her office. She gave no indication that would lead a reasonable person viewing this to view this was on her personal time at all. Kind of looks like it's official. Instead, the circumstances would lead a reasonable person to think that she was acting as Secretary of State with the authority of that state position, which is a public body, to invite members of the press into her office. And therefore, the arguments that this doesn't apply to her are unpersuasive. That's exploiting the position. Now, their third argument is that there was no violation because it doesn't apply here. They say her statements at the press conference show that she believed that other candidates could use the building. So I thought everybody could use this. But her belief was misplaced because it specifically prohibits it in this section of the law. And it is not a facility that any candidate can use, and she should know that because she's the Secretary of State. Now, last, the committee, for Jocelyn, argues that any violation of this section infringes on her rights under the First Amendment. Wow. So she's now got a First Amendment right to commit campaign finance fraud. In any event, the department has on multiple occasions recognized that the First Amendment is unpersuasive here. You can limit the time, place, and manner of these government buildings. It should be reasonably related to what you're doing. And so you can't use that argument. And so the big takeaway is here. It is determined that Secretary Benson's use of the Austin building lobby to hold a press conference to announce her candidacy is a violation of the law, Section 57 of the MCFA. You are adjudicated. Now, as for the claims raised in the complaint, they also assert claims about her conducting community conversations prior to her candidacy. They said that she went across the state to have, quote, community conversations, right, as her official secretary position requires her to do. She's campaigning. You're the secretary. You can't be double down delay on your campaigning. But there is no context in which to place those conversations. And depending on the specific circumstances, there could be an applicable exemption to this. So this claim will be dismissed. So it's not as cut and dry on that claim. Now, the complaint filed by Monica also refers to some other things. That claim is dismissed, saying neither the Department of State has any authority to determine whether she violated her own standards. And now, what is the penalty? Generally, complaints alleging violations of this law are investigated by the Secretary of State. But if it involves the Secretary of State, then we got to investigate it, the AG's office. When it comes to civil penalties, the MCFA states that a person who violates a provision of this is subject to a civil fine of not more than $1,000 for each violation, specific process to resolve these complaints, and more. And in fact, there are two ways that we can impose a civil fine. Although not specifically spelled out, could be a civil fine here. And if a conciliation agreement cannot be reached, then there can be enforcement of a criminal penalty if there was one, if you referred this to the AG and she said, actually, this is a crime, if determined to be necessary. Now, in contrast to the other detailed process, there's a little more gray area on how civil penalties work and who gets deposited, where does it go? Like the Secretary of State would normally collect the fine, but if she committed the problem, does the Attorney General's office get it, since we expect our Secretaries of State not to violate the law, all the things. When the legislature has expressly included language in one part of the statute, and this is confusing to us, and so we don't know exactly what to do. Therefore, under this language, the law seemingly gives no authority to the AG to seek criminal penalties for a violation of the Secretary of State. Wow. So she's above the law. Yeah, it could be viewed as odd and unfair that the Secretary of State, her immediate family, her campaign, they're the only people and entities subject to the requirements of the law, but not any of the penalties for violating them. Weird, they're all above the law. This may simply be a matter of legislative oversight, but for whatever reason, the legislature has not given the Attorney General any authority to penalize the Secretary of State. So no fines, no crimes. Consequently, the AG is left with no choice but to simply identify the violation, remind the Secretary of State of her obligations, and warn her against violating the laws in the future. Amazing. That said, so nothing can happen. She's totally above the law. She can break the laws, do whatever she wants. There's no power. That said, it's by no means unusual for the Secretary of State to resolve these complaints with warnings. Here is mentioned, Benson held a press conference indoors to shield the attendees from the weather under the mistaken belief that she could do this. Under the circumstances, resolving these complaints with a reminder and a warning is the appropriate sanction. It's also important to take the opportunity to point out the lack of enforcement options under the current language. There will be situations in the future where this happens, yet the MCFA does not treat the Secretary this unequal treatment, so the legislature blames Congress. So the Michigan House should go figure this out. Change the law if you want us to penalize her. She is hereby reminded that the law says you can't use the building lobby for your campaign garbage. Signed by Joshua O. Booth, This is our government in action, right? This is our government in action. Clear violation. She's the Secretary of State. She should know better than that, obviously. Breaks the law, campaigns early. A lot of it is totally untouchable. So no fine, no crimes, and those complaints are resolved. Very satisfactorily, no doubt, for Jocelyn. But her reign of corruption will continue in Michigan because they don't care. And a fellow Democrat, Dana Nessel, who many have said is contemplating a run for governor, is now going to just give her a gentle reminder, Jocelyn, don't do that again. No real repercussions because they're Democrats, and in their little kingdoms, they're, of course, above the law. All right, so we got that.